Training for a half marathon can be extremely daunting, especially if you've never done any running before. So today we're going to break down the different types of running and the different types of programming and your nutrition and all the things that go into actually executing a good, proper program. And once you understand these principles, running will be much less intimidating and hopefully make the habit of running way easier. The long run is an extremely important part of your training because without it, there's no acclimatization to the duration or mileage that you're going to be running on race day. So if you could imagine going from 2 to 4 miles to 13.1 miles, a half marathon, without any progression, that would be pretty bad. So that's the purpose of the long run, is basically just to increase mileage so to get you comfortable with the duration that you're going to be running on race day. Because the duration is a little bit longer, your intensity is going to come down. So a good rule of thumb is to run at a speaking pace. This is a pace that you could talk to a training partner without having to slow down or gasp for air. So when in doubt, run a little bit slower. A lot of people accidentally run these a little bit more intense because they're competitive and they want to run faster, right? And there's a time and a place for that later in the program. The purpose of the pace or the threshold run is to get you adapted to run at the intensity level of your race pace. So this is going to be run at your race pace or slightly more intense than your race pace. And because of the intensity, we're going to bring down the duration. So you're only going to start these at 10 to 15 minutes of continuous running at your race pace. And you're going to increase the duration of that run until you're about 30 minutes for an intermediate runner, or if you're advanced, you push the envelope a little bit there to 35, 40 minutes at your race pace. The purpose of interval training is to improve things like your aerobic capacity, your exercise economy, and runners call this the kick they can get during the race. So it just gives them that extra boost. And you'll see it's because the intensity is so high, you're forcing the body to adapt things like your anaerobic threshold or working at a very high intensity, which you produce lactate because you want to produce energy very quickly. And that adapts things like the enzymes in your muscle, in your mitochondria. And this is going to be important on race day when you're going to want a PR or a personal record. You're going to want to run more intense. And these interval training sessions are going to give you the power and the strength to actually perform that. The first one is the track repeat, and these are going to be run at a distance of 400 to 1200 meters, and that you can do that along a track. And your goal is to run for 3 to 5 minutes and then rest for 3 to 5 minutes depending on your workout prescription. And the intensity on this is going to be 85 to 90% of your VO2 max. So pretty dang intense, but it's not all out sprinting. And on this, you're going to focus on your running form. So you're going to focus on things like your step rate, not your step length, and then not vertically displacing your head when you're running. So you're not going to bob up and down. You're going to move that energy horizontally instead of vertically. And then you're going to think about having the shortest possible contact with your foot in the ground. So that's kind of a lot to think about. So you might want to get a running coach or just look a little bit more into running form. But this is going to help your running economy or that efficiency we were talking about earlier. So next we have hill sprints. And these are incredibly powerful tools we can use to gain power and strength in our legs. And they're going to be run for 30 seconds to 3 minutes, depending on the types of hills you have around your house. And tips on these are just to drive up the hill with as much power as possible. And if it's too intense or not intense enough, you can actually find a hill that is at a different grade to kind of get the intensity level that you'd like to achieve. So next we have the fartlek, which stands for speed play in Swedish. And essentially this is going to be a mix of your continuous and your interval training. And a good way to think about this is to just go for a run on a trail, and whenever you see a tree that's about 30 seconds out, you're going to sprint to it as fast as you can, focusing on your form, and then you're going to slow back down after you reach it, and you're going to rest for about 3 to 5 minutes, and you're going to repeat that for 2 to 6 miles. So this is going to help your ability to hit hills or just kind of shift gears from your lower intensity to your higher intensity to your lower intensity to your higher intensity. Cross training is important for us to add into our training so that we don't get injured or get bored, right? So what cross training can be is things like cycling, swimming, rowing. These are ways to do aerobic training that hit different joints in our body. So you're kind of dispersing the amount of fatigue that goes across your body instead of just constantly pounding the concrete with your ankles, your knees, and your hips. Like if you're rowing, for example, you're going to get some back fatigue, which is good because you don't want to overuse the same motion so that you can have a little bit more longevity in your training. And cross training also means resistance training. So resistance training for the runner is extremely important because your muscles are kind of like shock absorbers. So if you can imagine running for 2 hours straight without any muscle or minimal muscle, your shock absorbing capacity is going to be on your bone or your connective tissue. And so your big muscles like your calf muscle, your quads, your glutes, they're going to help you run more powerfully, and that's been shown in the literature to improve performance in runners. Strength training improves performance in runners, and it can also help reduce your injury risk. So it's kind of a win-win. So imagine, for example, you're doing 3 sets of 10 repetitions of a dumbbell lunge. This is going to improve the strength of a lot of muscles in your lower leg, like your quads and your glutes, and it's going to help you stabilize your core for when you're running those hard races. So finally, we get to the program, and this is going to be extremely variable based on things like your sex, your age, your weight, your training history. So a beginner might take a little bit longer, right, to kind of build up their aerobic base. So you might actually start with a walking program or a strengthening program to work on your weaknesses before you can actually run 13.1 miles at a decent pace, right? So the whole goal is to prevent injury and to optimize performance. So you kind of have to balance that with your subjective training history and who you are. So like a running frequency should be between 3 to 5 days a week. That's kind of a sweet spot because less than 3 days, you're not really training as hard as you should be, so you're not going to get as much performance. And then above 5 days, you might be compromising your recovery. So somewhere in that bandwidth. So if you're a kind of a reasonable, just base person, you might be able to do it in 3 to 6 months would be a reasonable timeline for a half marathon prep. And keep in mind that aerobic adaptations, so these are things like your aerobic base, can take a very long time. So improving your aerobic capacity by 10 to 30% can take up to 2 to 5 months. And so that's an extremely long time horizon. So I would give the advice to just take a longer time horizon. So maybe not running the half marathon next month, but maybe you'll do it next year, but you're going to start your training preparations now. The first part of the program is the preparatory phase. And with this, we're going to start at an intensity level a little bit lower, and we're going to increase our duration and intensity as we go along through the program. And this is going to allow us to not get injured. And depending on your goals, we're going to have this last anywhere from 4 weeks to 36 weeks so that we can build up slowly the tolerance we need for the next phase. So as race day approaches, we're going to shift training from general aerobic preparation and strength to specific preparation on race day. These are going to improve things like your technique, your endurance, and your speed. And goals are going to shift towards things like interval and threshold training so that on race day, you're going to be prepared to execute the intensity level that you want to achieve. A good rule of thumb is to not progress more than 10% in intensity or duration in any given week. And the whole purpose of this is just to give your body time to recover. 7 to 28 days before our race, we're going to implement what's called a taper. A taper just means it's a reduction in training volume so that you're going to train less and you're going to increase your energy intake. And what this is going to do is allow you to recover from all of the training in the program, but the nutrition is going to allow you to increase the amount of glycogen or energy stores in your muscle so that on race day, you feel fresh, you feel like you're ready to achieve your race pace goals. Calories are a unit of energy, and when we're running, we're producing energy with our muscles. And where do we get the energy from? Our diet, right? So running can actually burn an incredible amount of calories, and that's why people use it for weight loss frequently. So for me, I weigh 250 pounds, and I run maybe for 60 minutes on my easy runs at about a 6 mile per hour pace. And using the equations we have from the literature, you can see that that's over 1,000 calories that if we're not replacing in our diet, you're going to be pulling things from, your muscle tissue or your organs, or, you're not going to be able to sustain that for very long without replacing it with your nutrition. So we have different macronutrients, and carbohydrate are in the literature shown to improve performance. So a high carbohydrate diet compared to a high protein or a high fat diet has been shown to improve performance. So this is because carbohydrate and glycogen have a very close relationship. So what glycogen is, it's basically sugar in your muscle. And if you can imagine sugar in your muscle, you can burn that very quickly to produce energy, right? So carbohydrate intake before, during, and after exercise optimizes the amount of glycogen you store and replenish, and that's going to improve your performance. So the general recommendation for athletes is about 4 to 10 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate, and it should probably comprise around 55 to 70% of your total caloric intake. And depending on the amount that you're running that day or training that day, you're going to need more or less. So for instance, if you're running 1 hour or less, you only need to eat 5 to 7 grams per kilogram a day. 1 to 3 hours of training is 6 to 10 grams per kilogram, and 4 hours or more is 10 to 12 grams per kilogram. That is an insane amount of carbohydrate. So experiment for yourself what you can tolerate. In events lasting longer than 1 hour, you're going to want to be eating food while you're running. And these are going to be things like gel packs, honey. On race day, they have Gatorade and gel packs. So next we have carbohydrate loading. And this is going to be intaking 8 to 10 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate 72 hours before the race, and 10 to 12 grams per kilogram 36 to 48 hours before race day. And this is actually going to improve performance. And the idea behind this is that with the taper, we're going to decrease the amount of glycogen we're using, and we're going to increase it in our diet, right? So we're going to have a super physiological amount of glycogen to pull from during race day. And this is going to basically improve the amount of energy stores you have. So when it comes down to it and you're trying to PR and you're trying to hold that race pace, you can dig deep and grab some of that rice. And personally, my favorite way to do this is a rice cooker. I found to be an extremely useful tool to get in enough carbohydrate, because eating that much carbohydrate for me as a bodybuilder is kind of foreign. So find what works for you, and I will say, do not do this for the first time on race day. So that long run, that's maybe 10 to 12 miles, treat that like the actual half marathon. So you're going to eat the same types of foods that you're experimenting with and see what you tolerate through the race, so that you're not kind of breaking down through your digestive system on race day. So as a bodybuilder, protein has always been a big part of my diet. But endurance athletes should actually consume 1.2 to 2 grams per kilogram of their body weight. This is actually a pretty high amount of protein. And when you see people like Kipchoge that are kind of thin marathon runners, super efficient, super light, they need to eat a good amount of protein, because when you're running, if you can imagine, you're just destroying a lot of muscle, a lot of bone that you need to recover. And the only way you can get this is from a source of dietary protein. So the range should be 10 to 35% of your total caloric intake, and then that gram per kilogram prescription. And if you are trying to lose weight and you're running, you're going to want to be on the higher end of the protein distribution, so that when you're losing weight, you're not pulling that from your muscle tissue, because protein is actually muscle sparing. Endurance athletes should consume at least 20 to 25% of their diet from fat sources. This is because fat is important for things like your endocrine system, so hormones, so things like testosterone. They need fat to be made. So you should never neglect fat you should always be eating some percentage. Some athletes actually say that you should only be eating fat sources and you should be going down on your carbohydrate. These are people who can actually adapt to be butter burners. But personally, just looking at the literature, I think carbohydrates and glycogen are an extremely good way to improve your race day performance, especially for a lower mileage event like half marathons. Even though they are 13.1 miles, there's a big difference between that race and, say, an ultra marathon where you will be actually pulling from fat sources more. So personally, I think carbohydrates are a good way to improve performance, but if your body works better with fat, go with fat. So to optimize your nutrition and hydration status, you can drink caffeine through tea or coffee on race day, and it's been shown that consumption of 5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight can increase the amount of time you can exercise before you're exhausted. So next we have our pre-competition meal. And this is very important because if your race is at 7 a.m., you're maybe not going to be waking up at 3 a.m. to eat a big meal, right? So if you're eating 1 or fewer hours before your race, your goal is going to be 0.5 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate. For me, this looks like coffee sweetened with honey, get a little bit of that caffeine, and then the simple carbohydrate in the banana. And if you're eating 2 hours before, you're going to be eating 1 gram per kilogram of carbohydrate. So you can eat things like toast and a little bit of protein like egg, fruit, and coffee. 4 hours before, you're going to eat 1 to 4 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate and 0.15 to 0.25 grams per kilogram of protein. And this can be like a breakfast burrito with fruit, and this is 4 hours before, right? And then after an intense race, glycogen stores are extremely depleted. And just to improve with recovery and how you feel, you can eat small carbohydrate snacks every 15 to 60 minutes. So next we have hydration, and we're going to drink 5 to 12 ounces of water if we're running under an hour every 15 to 20 minutes. And this is because we're going to lose water through our breath and through our sweat, which we need to replace because we're going to drop our blood volume if it's not replaced, right? So if you're running over an hour, it's actually recommended to have water, sugar, and electrolyte drink, and the carbohydrate should be in a concentration of 5 to 10% of carbohydrate solution if you're making it yourself. Or you could just have things like Powerade or Gatorade because they are in that bandwidth of glucose. So for race day, we're going to sleep 7 to 9 hours the day before. We're going to get there early, warm up. We're going to eat our pregame nutrition. We're going to bring some nutrition. So I would personally recommend some gel packs because on race day, every incremental 2 to 3 miles are going to have carbohydrates in the form of gels or electrolytes, and you're just going to have to see what they have. I would say to bring your own nutrition so you're not relying on their system, because you don't want to be left without nutrition on race days to meet your goals. After the race, expect sore legs. You might have some pain, and I would say to not immediately drop to the ground with your back on the road, because you want to slowly decrease your heart rate, because your heart rate is going to be pretty high. It's going to be pretty elevated, especially if you finish the race pretty strongly. You're going to want to walk maybe with your hands behind your head so that you're going to gradually decrease the amount of beats per minute your heart is working at. And this is just going to help with recovery. And you might do some light static stretching. When your heart rate comes down, you're going to refuel with fluids and carbohydrates and protein. There is no one-size-fits-all program. Your unique training history, your conditioning, your age, your sex, your body mass, it's all going to require professional consideration. The intent of this video was just to give you an educational tool so that you can understand the types of training and how programming is actually performed. And it's not prescriptive in any way, and it should only be used for educational purposes only. So to learn more about nutrition, strength training, running, you can check my website, cartergansky.com, and let me know if you found this useful in the comments, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.